Good afternoon, all. I'm always apologizing for the erratic timing of this shiur, but the reality is most people see it on archived Facebook or YouTube. Anyway, please feel free to go to my YouTube channel. You can just do a search for YouTube, Sandra Epstein, Saundra. Obviously, we are all on tentacles at this point in time. We are all hurting. Our hearts are broken. And yet, we go on. That's what we do. We go on. We hold everybody in our hearts. We hold multiple truths simultaneously about what is happening in the world. And we continue. So, Parshat VaYeira. I have entitled this Mothers, Prophets, and God. Last year, I focused on the disappointments we may feel when reading and learning about our avot v'imahot and their actions, albeit in very extreme and troubling circumstances. As we established, and many have thought, these were merely human beings faced with difficult choices, making imperfect decisions, and living within the limits of their own humanity, not significantly different than you or I. And perhaps, as I have often suggested, this is precisely the value of these stories and learning about the adventures and the misadventures of those who have helped us establish so much in thinking about our relationship with each other and to God and to others around us. This year, let us look at this same Torah portion of VaYeira and consider its companion, the Haftarah from Melachim, the Book of Kings 2, chapter 4, 1 through 37, which parallels the many mitzvot that we pick up from Avraham Avinu in the stories of the prophet Elisha. Our prophets are called specifically the prophets of social justice. And in the stories we will witness in this Haftarah, there is kindness shown to others, paralleling the kindness that Avraham Avinu will show to his mysterious guests, as well as the people of Sodom and Amorah, when arguing with God regarding their fate. Achnasat orchim, welcoming guests, valuing of children, and the presence of God as healer, as well as the need for faith in God, clearly dominates these narratives. We begin with our Haftarah from Melachim. A woman cries out to Elisha, saying, "Your servant, my husband, has died, and you know that I am a Yered et Hashem, that I fear that I have all for God, and the creditor has come, the one to whom I owe money, or we owed money, to take my 2 children for himself as slaves," which was a common practice at the time. Elisha says to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me what you have in the house." And she says, "Your maidservant has nothing in the house except for 1 jug of oil." He says, "Borrow vessels for yourself from outside, from all your neighbors, and you will come and close the door, and you will fill these vessels." Now, first of all, she's borrowing vessels from her neighbors. So already we're seeing deeds of kindness that will facilitate what she needs to do. She goes away, she closes the door, and everyone was bringing vessels to her, and she's pouring it. When the vessels are full, she says to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he says, "There is no other vessel. The oil stopped." She comes and she tells Elisha, the man of God, and he says, "Go sell the oil, shami et nisyach, va'atu vanecha tichia benotar, and you and your sons will live with the remainder that will sustain you." She does what Elisha asks of her, as Avraham, along with Sarah, do what God asked of them. One would imagine that these actions are accompanied by faith and that they have meaning. Elisha then leaves, and he goes to Shunem, and there's a prominent woman there who prevails upon him to eat a meal, Achnasat orchim again. And it was that whenever he would pass by, he would be invited in for a meal. She says to her husband, "Behold, I know that he is a holy man of God, who passes us regularly. Let us make him a little room upstairs. We have room in our house, and when he comes, he will stay with us." And one of the things we know about Achnasat orchim is that there are many, many, many ways we can do it, and some are small, some are big, and we don't forget these deeds. He goes upstairs, he lies down, and he says to Gehazi, his servant, "Call this woman He calls her, and she comes to stand before him. He says, look, you have made yourself busy. You have prepared all on our account, just as Abram and Sarah did prepare for the Malachim. What can I do for you? Can I speak on your behalf to the king or to the general of the army? And she says, no, I am staying with my people. He says, what can we do for her? And Gehazi looks at him, at Elisha, and says, she has no son. Her husband is old. Again, paralleling the Abraham and Sarah story. And valuing children. He summoned her. She stood there. And he says, again, paralleling Abraham and Sarah, at this time next year, the Moed Hazeh et Chayat Choveket Ben, you will be embracing a son. And she says, look, don't mess around with me. Remember, Sarah laughs, okay? The woman conceives, bears a son, and everything happens as was said. The child grows up, and one day he goes out to his father, to the reapers, and he says to his father, my head, it hurts. And his father says to the servant, take him to his mother, carries him, brings him to his mother. He sat on her knees until noon, and he died. Now, again, in the Avraham story, and this Parsha will end with Akedat Yitzchak, which Yitzchak is not ultimately sacrificed, but the threat of something happening to that child for whom one has yearned so long. This couple and Abram and Sarah have both. They're older. They've never had children. They didn't think they were going to have children, and then they do. And then, potentially, this child is taken away. In fact, one of the explanations of a lot of the classical commentators of the beginning of Chaye Sarah, which we will get into next week, where Sarah dies, is from the shock of what was happening with the Akedah. Elisha takes the child, carries him, brings him into this room, and he basically does what we understand to be CPR. She says to Elisha, did I not ask for a son? Why do you give me a son and then take him away? But Elisha comes, closes the door, prays to God. He goes up, he lays on the child. He, if you look at verse 34, places his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, vayasam piva, nav, nav, kabab, absolutely paralleling the child, and the child's flesh becomes warm. The child is brought back to life. The woman comes, she falls at his feet, bows to the ground. She picks up her son and departed. So we have Hachnasat Dorchim, B'li Gvulot, without any boundaries. She not only feeds him, she not only gives him a place to come, she fixes a room for him. He comes there. Again, it started with everybody giving the previous woman in Elisha's story the pots and the pans and whatever to hold the oil. So people are working together. One of the things that we are saying about Israel right now, with everything that is swirling and going around, is that where they were arguing about so much, about politics, about the changing in the justice system, about what Netanyahu is or is not doing, all these things, the datim, the lo datim, all of this, that there seems to be in this time of stress, in this time of profound and cataclysmic angst, a sense of unity, a sense of coming together. And if you look at everybody coming together to help this woman, in the first story, there's a lesson there. Let us stop here and take note about these stories of not having children in advanced ages and then having them, saving children from horrible fates, having a child die and then be brought back to life in the Melachim story. In the Akedah story, obviously it stops short of that, but you can imagine when Yitzhak says to Avram, where is the animal for the sacrifice? The pain of women. And here we evoke the story of the Akedah, the emotions, the perspectives of Abraham, and perhaps by association Sarai, even though we don't hear her voice. Let's consider the narrative at the end of our Parsha from VaYeira. And we go back to VaYeira now, Parshat VaYeira. It comes to pass, VaYiachar devarim ha'elam Elokim Nisa et Avraham v'yomer, I love Avraham v'yomer hineni. And after all of these experiences, God comes, tests Avraham, and says, Avraham, he says, here I am. So this seems to be between Avraham and God only. Yitzhak does not say anything at this point. Sarai is not present. And it seems to be a conversation between the two of them specifically. He says, Kach na et bincha et yechidcha asher hafta et Yitzchak v'lech lecha. So I just want to look at verse 2 for a moment. And he says, take, please, your son, your only one, whom you love, Yitzchak, v'lech lecha, and go for your own sake, evoking last week's Parsha. In other words, these things are for his benefit. But then he says, go to the land of Moriah, v'halehu sham la'ola, and prepare, bring up a burnt offering, alachad harim asher amer lecha, that I will tell you. Abraham gets up early in the morning, saddles his donkey, takes his two young men. We basically know the story. And on the third day, Abraham lifts up his eyes and sees the place from afar. Abraham says to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go. We will prostrate ourselves, and we will return to you. So what did Abraham know here to say that? Why did he insist on doing this alone? Abraham takes the wood for the burnt offering, he places it, and then his son Isaac, and they go, and they both go together. It says in the text, Vayalchu shneim yachdav, they went as one. And it's at this point Yitzchak says to Abraham, he says, my father, Avi. And again, for the second time, Abraham says, Hineni, here I am. Abraham is present. So if Abraham is present and understands all the complexities of what is going on here, and is somehow holding these multiple truths simultaneously, I love God, I follow God, I love my son, God is asking me to sacrifice my son. How does he do that? These are conflicting truths in our human minds. But Abraham says to him, God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And again we read, Vayalchu shnehem yachdav, for the second time. They come to the place that God had spoken of. Abraham builds the altar, arranges the wood, binds his son Isaac, stretches forth his hand, takes the knife to slaughter, and the angel of God comes and says, Abraham, third time, he says, Hineni. He's present. So when you look at this repetition, this kind of pismon, this refrain of Hineni, it feels like Abraham is present in a very profound, in a very intentional way. And then again, we're left with, but how do we do the calculus of holding all these multiple truths? God, of course, says, do not stretch your hand. Abraham looks up, he sees a ram, he takes the ram, he goes and he sacrifices the ram. And of course, there are many, many aspects of this story that we hold on to in different ways. So Abraham at this point returns to his two men that he left, and he has been given this promise that God says to him, you will be blessed by all the nations of the world, Ekev, because, it's conditional, because you have listened to my voice. You have passed my test. You have been here. You have said Hineni. You have brought your son, your only son, that you love that much, the one that you hold on to as your inheritor. Obviously, he had another son, Yishmael, and we could get into this whole thing, again, holding multiple truths. Does Avram not love Yishmael? We read, when he sends away Hagar, there's pain, and even the name Yishmael, God hears you. It's such a beautiful name. And as I often say, except for Rabbi Yishmael, we don't use it in the Jewish community, which is a shame, because it is a beautiful name. But God hears all of us. And I think part of the idea here that Elisha is conveying as a prophet, that maybe Sarai knows in her silence, is that God is holding multiple truths. And that is the challenge to us, to hold multiple truths, to hold our love for God, to hold our love for our children, to hold what we have to do, to hold when there are forced choices, to hold conflicting truths, as many of us are doing right now, given the world situation. It does not mean that we love what we love anything less. It does not mean that we are any less loyal to Israel, for example. It does not mean that we are any less holding the idea that kol nefesh, every human being counts, and we don't want the death of innocent people to happen. And yet we are being asked to hold all these truths simultaneously. And it's painful. It hurts. It breaks our heart. Here we have the template for the story of pain of parents and the fate of their children. The voice of the children is absent in all of these stories, except for Yitzhak asking his one question. Here, this is between Abraham and God. And in Melachim, I want you to note that as Sarai is quiet here, it is between the suffering mothers and Elisha. The women are having the voice here, either directly or through an agent such as Gehazi, who recognizes what they need, what they want. Sarah's voice is absent in VaYeira. And as I said, many of our commentators point out the next thing we read about her is her death in the beginning of the following Parsha. And we have to consider that perhaps that death is somehow connected to the shock of what she experienced quietly during the drama of the Akedah. We see a similar dynamic in the second story about Elisha, where it is Gehazi who voices what the Shunammite woman does have and does not have, and so dearly wants, a child. While there are instances of admirable behaviors here, there is something else of critical importance which we cannot let go. There may be no way to capture this phenomenon in words adequately, but we all intuitively understand on some level the pervasive role of faith. The faith that the women show in these stories, the faith that prophets show in these stories, and the faith that we all struggle with, hold on to, that it allows us to breathe in our relationships with God. And here is where I want to refer to some beautifully crafted words of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. Quote begins. Faith is the courage to take a risk. Avram and Sarah took the risk of following the voice calling them to leave their land and their birthplace, to travel to an unknown destination, as the Israelites did when they began their journey into a desert, into an unknown land. To be a Jew is to take the risk of believing that the evils of this world are not inevitable or irremediable, that we can mend some of the fractures of humanity, that we, by loving others as God loves us, can bring the Shekhinah into our lives, turning a little of the prose of the human condition into poetry and song. Jews do not accept suffering that can be alleviated or wrong that can be put right as the will of God. We accept only what we cannot change. What we can heal, we must. So disproportionately, Jews are to be found as teachers fighting ignorance, doctors fighting disease, economists fighting poverty, and lawyers fighting injustice. Judaism has given rise, not in one generation, but in more than 100, to an unrivaled succession of prophets, priests, philosophers, poets, masters of halacha and agadah, commentators, codifiers, rationalists, mystics, sages, saints, people who give the divine presence its local habitation and name. We bring God into the world by our actions. We are taught to make gentle the life of this world. Judaism has consistently asked great things of our people, and in so doing has helped to make them great. Avram takes a risk that's based in faith. When it says, "V'nisa et Avraham achar devarim ha'eleh," it is setting this test as the pinnacle of testing Avram's faith, because we know that Avram has had other tests. But this is set aside. Sarah has to have even more faith, because Sarah isn't in discussion with God, not publicly. And Elisha is placing his faith in God, and the various women are opening their hearts and providing sustenance, are providing support, and in turn will be supported. While in the text of our Torah, we do get some sense of Abraham's faith, we are left to imagine how this must have played a role for Yitzhak and for Sarah. Faith is quiet. Faith is personal. Faith is individuated. Faith is what brings us to God. In the stories of Melachim, we have noted that we see it a little bit more from the mother's angles. However, in the end, each of us is left to negotiate the faith we are going to have in God and how it will carry us through life's challenges, not negating our need to act kindly and care about others around us. We must learn and we must continually try to hold these different elements in our lives and activate them. And at this point in time, where those of us who are holding multiple truths, we support Israel. We are pained by the death of all innocent victims. We want governments to do better. We call terrorism what it is. We have to be careful where we get our news. We have to be careful how we walk. We have to not stop talking with each other. Even those of us who hold the multiple truths, as we interact with others who cannot, we still have to rely on our faith that God is directing us and that we can work to build a better world and to ourselves and in helping others work to do better. Faith is what the mothers and the prophets showed then. Faith is what Abraham showed. Faith is what we must all show in our lives every day. Shabbat shalom lekulam. Be safe, be well, and just hold your multiple truths together.